I'm Scott Al Miller. This is my everyday life living in Latin America. We had a popular video that went up not very long ago called It's Time to Get Out Now, or the time is whatever. And there's a lot of feedback on this video. So I'm going to do a video where I'm doing in little pieces, directly answering a lot of the feedback that we get, because I think there's a lot of people who are, one, maybe have some really good points, two, maybe reacting emotionally and are afraid that the answer is that they need to get out, and they're worried that that is the answer, so they're trying to create a framework to justify not leaving. And for others, they may need to know that it's too late, and they need to figure out what their alternative plans are. I'm already working with people who are months past being too late. People are now starting to struggle with getting out. People who have all their ducks in a row and can get out, believe everything's fine, but they haven't tried to start from ground zero, and we're really seeing families face the problem that they are, in some cases, trapped. We've had some people trapped for a bit of time but managed to get out. We have some who've been trapped for extreme amounts of time and have no real belief that they're going to make it. And so this is a far more important topic than I think people realize. Someone said, shouldn't this title have a question mark at the end? And I said, well, really only is, did you already miss your chance? I think a lot of people are really hopeful that there's more time to wait, and there could be. But the risk assessment says no. The time is absolutely past or now, but waiting longer is a risk we can't possibly recommend. Let's dig into these comments. I think there's a lot of good ones, and it's important to go through some of this feedback because that people do have points and people do have concerns. So we're going to get to that right after the bump. Okay, I've got my screen over here, so you'll excuse if I'm reading to the side. From Greg Durham, he says, I'm collecting Social Security, and if I move to Latin America and the prices go up, then I'm screwed. Not true, just start there. But okay, I'm screwed because with the retirement visa, I won't be able to work to make additional money. All right, so first of all, Latin America is more than 17 legal jurisdictions. So you can't say that one visa defines anything, right? This is one of those complete myths that exist for a lot of people. It's not an American thing, it's not a Canadian thing, nothing like that. People moving to a new country for the first time, or people considering it for the first time, very often believe that a retirement visa or a work visa or whatever are very specific things, and that they're the ones. And they're often not saying that the one in the U.S. is what they're replicating, but they know of one, often one in Mexico for many people, and then they believe that that is the same in all countries. We see this a lot with people who think they need to do Mexican application processes for other countries, and they'll be like, well, I haven't done this thing. And we're like, that's Mexico only. You're not going to Mexico. Why would you do that? And they're like, wait, it's different? Like, yes, every country has a completely different what to do, what you can do, what you should do, and so forth. So that's just a thing that people normally have. So in this case, he's believing a couple misnomers, 3 key ones about the visa and a 4th one about the prices. Let's start with the prices. If the prices go up in Latin America, he is screwed. That is not true. It is theoretically possible, but keep in mind that the prices in Latin America are way lower than the US, and we're not facing any world factor that predicts that our prices are going to go up in any meaningful way. We're not having any of the things that are triggering it in other places. Americans are told the whole world is falling apart, but that is not the case. It is a North America and European thing that is going on. Here in Latin America, we're broadly not affected by any of that stuff. That doesn't mean we couldn't be, but we're not, and there's no reason to think that we would be. So this is what we call what if, right? What if this thing that I have no reason to believe could happen, then this other thing would happen? Well, you can't use what if. We talked about this on the live stream. I have a video about this, but as someone who worked in risk assessment for finance, right, you never say what if. You work from statistics. The moment you start leaving statistics and saying what if, that is a way for your brain to tell you and everyone else you have lost the sense of logic and you've gone to panic. It is an emotional. What ifs are emotional. We shouldn't use them. Any what if that exists is built into the statistics. We can have different videos on that. We already have them, but that's an important thing. So this is a what if, so it's an inappropriate way to view the world, but it's also a meaningless one. So what if the prices went up in Latin America? Sure, but what if the prices doubled in America? He says, well, I can't go find a job. Can you find a job in America that's going to allow you to pay for whatever the what if expansion of inflation is? No, you're also going to starve there. You don't give up a good solution and stick with a bad one, because what if the good one becomes bad? yes, if you have a reason to believe that the good one will become bad, and you have a good reason to believe that the bad one will become good, then you can take your assessment based on how reasonable you think those chances are of coming to fruition. But in a situation where you have no reason to believe that the good situation is going to become bad, or that the bad situation isn't going to keep getting worse, and those are the things that are predicted and that seem logical, and that you have very clear triggers causing one to stay good and one to keep getting bad, then you do not avoid ever, no matter what logic you're trying to throw at this, you do not avoid fixing the situation. He's basically saying, if I eat, I don't want to avoid starvation. So if I eat, what if they take my food away? I'd rather start with no food. You don't do that. Of course, you go and eat the fruit that you have. You don't starve now to avoid the possibility of starving in the future, and not even a good possibility, just a really unlikely one. That makes it sound really crazy to have done such a thing, but this is a logic that people often apply. The second thing that is hinted in here is that if he moves to where things are good now, moving to Latin America, that he is then trapped there. And so if the United States became good again in the future and Latin America became bad, he's acting like he'd be trapped in Latin America, but he's not. He's an American. He can just move back to the United States. So unless he believes that the U.S. is so problematic in this future vision that he would not be able to return to his own country, then and that's okay. You can hypothesize that and then put a risk number on that, but he's not mentioning it. So it's not something that he's verbalizing in this case, and we really shouldn't consider it because that's an unbelievably unprecedented situation. And if that kind of thing was to happen, none of the risk assessments we're doing will matter at all. And the one thing you would know is that you definitely needed to be in Latin America. So that would be a self-fulfilling situation. Well, this terrible thing happened. Oh, it made the opposite, right? It just solves it. So the foundation of his concern isn't true. There's no reason to make a response based on this unexpected thing. There's no reason to avoid solving his problems, and there's no reason to believe or suggest or even think that by moving to a different country, by traveling, by experiencing lower costs in another country, that he would somehow lose access to the original country. That's one of the great things about being an expat, is that you can move anywhere, and not literally, but you can keep moving. You aren't locked into a place. And yes, he's in retirement. Presumably he's on Social Security. The fear of moving or the effort of moving in the future are things he needs to consider. That makes sense. But so is starvation. So is how far is his money going to go. So this is he's pushing for a reckless financial decision. Go where it's quite literally, 5 to 10 times the cost of living, and lose the money that he has, because that money's gone. Once he spends it on food, once he spends it on housing, once he spends it on transportation in the United States, he can't get that back. That is money he could move to Latin America and be saving to hedge against future problems. So he's making an immediate bad financial decision that impacts him going forward. And that's not something you want to do. When you're trying to fix your finances, you start fixing them now. So this is just a bad financial approach given his concerns. Now, the second part is, basically what he's saying is with a retirement visa, let's stop there. Why is he going to use a retirement visa? That may not be what's needed to live wherever he wants to go. Now, maybe he's talking about Nicaragua because I am based in Nicaragua, and so a lot of people assume that is the context that they're responding on and don't always say it or make it clear. Now, he mentions Latin America, so that's why I'm not automatically adding a Nicaraguan context here. If he was coming to Nicaragua, then there is good reason to believe he might want the retirement visa, and the retirement visa does not allow you to work in Nicaragua, meaning it does not allow you to take a Nicaraguan job. If he has a slightly higher income from his retirement, then he could get a rentista visa, but that one also does not allow you to work in Nicaragua, so it doesn't really matter in this particular instance, but it's important to note there's little reason to believe he would need the pensionado, which is the retirement visa. But there are other options, and most importantly, it doesn't matter. We have a lot of videos on this. Now, I realize a lot of people are new to the channel because of this video, so understandably. But we have a lot of videos that talk about how even if you have a visa like I do that allows me to work in Nicaragua, you don't use it. That is completely illogical and shows a complete misunderstanding of the markets and labor and how you work in these countries and how you make all these things work. There is no situation that we have ever discovered, and I have talked to so many people over so many years who believe they need to work in the country that they're moving to, but never once has someone even remotely convinced me that they had any reason to think they would ever want to take a job in the country except that they are completely confused because the pay scales here in the country are so low, and taking a job here would take a job away from a Nicaraguan who needs it, using Nicaragua as the example. And as an American, even one that is retired, has the right to take jobs and labor in the United States, or the right to start a business in the United States and take profits from it. So even if you are working but you're not allowed to work, there's ways around that too. You have essentially massive ability to earn a living in the United States where things are expensive and rates are high, and to bring that money into Latin America. And because of the way the US tax code works, unless he was rich, which he's not, he's talking about whether he can afford food, so we have to assume he's on a reasonable retirement budget, then all the money he brings in from any salary from the United States would also be tax-free in the case of Nicaragua and many other countries. So for the reasons he mentions, he needs to be in Nicaragua. Yes, it's true that if he only felt he could take a job as a janitor and the only place he could get that job is in the United States, then okay, that portion of his argument could border on true, but that implies things like he can't speak, just doesn't know English. Like there's so many entry-level online jobs that pay so well and are tax-free from the United States to here that having any idea that you're going to want to do something else just does not make sense. Not at all. So his best bet in any conceivable scenario is to get to Latin America right away. Maybe not Nicaragua. We're not saying that's the choice. We're just saying that getting out of the United States and finding the right place. It could be Southeast Asia. It could be somewhere in Africa. It could be anywhere in Latin America. It could even be somewhere in Europe, right? There's lots of places in the world that may provide the things that you need. I happen to be in Latin America, so a lot of people look at it from that perspective, and certainly I think it's a great option. And Nicaragua, where I live, is one of the absolute best for people who are in this scenario. There is basically zero risk to the thing he's worried about, and nearly 100% benefits for all the things that he's saying that he wants. He's avoiding the solution by using this what if. But every single thing he said, if those were his concerns, he would be in Nicaragua tomorrow. If his concern was affording food, he'd be in Nicaragua. If his concern was being able to get a job and being able to afford living, should his retirement not be enough money to pay for things, he'd be in Nicaragua. For all of his concerns, the one thing he wouldn't do is consider staying in the United States. So that's my reading into his concerns. He's getting all the answers backwards because he's using a what if that can't work. It just doesn't work that way. And he's ignoring that you can work when you're on a retirement visa. You just can't work locally, which you didn't want to do anyway, so that's a red herring. And that you can't move back to the United States. In that absolute worst case scenario, you can just move back. So every possible thing that he is concerned about is covered. That's the great thing. We have 100% coverage of his concerns by moving to Latin America today. But even if we took away that ability to move back to the United States and said you can't have that, that's what we'll call the brute force solution to his problem. Even without that, he has 99.9% of possible future scenarios say that being in Latin America is what protects him, and 0.1% says that would have been the wrong decision. So in 1,000 scenarios, we're estimating, only one of them would it not be the thing to do. If you knew that you had 999 chances of avoiding a car crash and 0.1% chance of doing a car crash, would you pick that, or would you choose to roll the dice on the 0.1 as the thing that you're going to prepare for? No, you go for the essentially guaranteed thing, right? This is the emotional response that we worry about with people, that they don't want it to be true, and they'll grasp at what if scenarios to try to tear apart the statistics and the logic and the obvious paths. This next one's just a comment, but I'm reading these because it's great to have them. Hi, Scott. Great video as usual. In Canada, things are not much better than the States. To me, it's time to get out of here. Now, we did a video about 6 months ago about Canadians wanting to get out. We're certainly seeing a lot of Canadians coming into Nicaragua. And again, we're just one popular location. We're one that makes sense for a lot of people, but all of Latin America and lots of other regions are really nice too. We got a lot of videos that help you decide on regions and countries and that kind of stuff. Be sure to check those out. Be sure to like and subscribe to all that stuff. But Nicaragua, yeah, I love it. It's where I picked. But don't feel that that's the only choice for you. We're not saying you got to come to Nicaragua. We're saying that you need to really seriously consider that if you're going to protect against these things, you need to take action today. All right, he says, if the economic uncertainty is not enough, we can add the brutal winters to the reason for leaving. We just came back from beautiful Nicaragua, and the country would be a good fit for us. We might see you around in the near future. Well, that's awesome. I love to hear people talking this way, because here in Nicaragua, we love making new friends and having new people come join us in the country. We've had, at the time that I'm recording this, I've been helping nearly 20 people actively move into the country this week. We have so many people moving in that it's completely changing how we see immigration to the country. It's an amazing thing. A year ago, we would once in a while see somebody moving in, which still means there's lots more that we don't see moving in. But now we're actually seeing huge numbers. And that's, when I say there's 20 people moving in, most of those we're crossing paths with out here in the West, not even in the capital or other more popular regions. If I was in San Juan del Sur or Granada, I might be seeing 100 people per week that I cross paths with. So it's really incredible. All right, so we're going to read another one here. Robert McKenzie says, I don't think Latin America will be better off when current affairs have a ripple effect in the future. So that's an interesting take, and there's some validity to that. Can major problems in the United States and Canada ripple across Latin America? Of course, they can have an effect. To believe that they would have a ripple effect that would make Latin America, which is starting from a point that is so much better than the United States and Canada, and that ripple effect would somehow not just affect them, but take them not just at a ratio up to as bad as it is in the US and Canada, but to actually catch them up to it is unprecedented and impossible. Like, it's just not reasonable in any way to believe it would do that. Now, could it have an impact on the region? Absolutely. Is the sphere of influence of the US so great that other countries are going to be impacted? Yes. But is it in any way reasonable to believe that far-flung countries, especially those that are not actively part of the US ecosystem, are going to somehow catch up to and match all of the problems in the United States? No. And it's never happened before. You can't come up with any examples of that in history, I don't believe. And you certainly are not going to find countries that magically became as rich as the United States because the United States did well. So if the U.S. does poorly, we also have no reason to believe that they would also do as poorly. It goes together. Either they're in lockstep or they're not, and no one is. So that Latin America has been disconnected from the United States for all time. There's absolutely no reason to project that all economics and world history will suddenly change in a really dramatic way, and that all of the independent countries in Latin America will together do this really unprecedented thing. That's, I feel, it's a very emotional thing. Like, oh, I don't want this to be true, so I'm going to project these really weird things. And I understand we have these emotional reactions, and I understand that people are trying to desperately tell each other that things are going to be okay, or that everywhere else is bad, so don't do this thing that is good for you. But everyone wants to hurt everyone else, right? This is why, if you're afraid, if you feel you don't have the ability to move, if you're afraid of if your neighbor's moving, though, the first thing you're going to do is try to talk them out of it. You're going to try to make it sound scary out there, especially if you're scared. If the reason you're not willing to move is because you're terrified of the world, you don't think you're going to be able to handle it, well, you don't want other people to benefit from that. Sure, some people do, really nice people do, but tons of people, especially when they're having a fear emotional reaction, they're going to start lashing out in it's scary out there. If you've ever heard someone try to tell you that places like Nicaragua or El Salvador are dangerous, we are so safe. This is so good. And they'll try to say, oh, you're not welcome there. You're way more welcome than you are in your home country. You're safer, you're more welcome, it's easier to live here, you get better healthcare here, you get free healthcare here, you don't have to, it's so much better. Nicaragua loves you more than your country does by orders of magnitude. It's not even discussable the amount that America hates Americans and treats them with disdain. Have you ever heard of needing health insurance? Have you ever heard of those high costs on things? Guess what? That is the government telling you they don't like you and they want you to leave. That is the only possible way to read into that. They don't want you to have good health. They don't want you to be able to acquire good health. They don't want you to be able to afford good health. Why would they go through such great lengths to do that if they cared in this loving way? And yet other countries, when Americans come there, are like, of course we're going to take care of your health. Of course we're not going to do that. We actually care. Right? Coming to other countries, and it's not just Nicaragua. I've lived in Spain, was treated this way. Lived in Greece, was treated this way. Visited France, was treated this way. Lived in Italy, was treated this way. Right? They're so thankful that you're there, or they just care about people. And that's how they behave. So this effect is really important to understand, that you're being told all these scary things, this emotional plea, please don't discover the world, please don't leave us, don't leave those of us who are too scared, don't leave those of us who didn't prepare behind. We need you to stay behind and prop us up. We need you to stay behind and take care of us, because when you hear that response, that person is trying to create a welfare situation. They see you as their meal ticket and they need you to stay. Because they believe, and they're probably correct, that their affluence is dependent on pulling it out of you. or people like you, and they know that if you leave, then someone else will leave. If you find out the truth, you'll spread the news. They don't want those things to happen. Right? So that is if you see that. And so I understand that Robert in this case is probably hearing this from loads of people who are desperately afraid that he figures out that there's better things out there. So they come up with these things, and a few people say it, and it sounds kind of reasonable if you don't stop and think about it. But if you actually stop and think about it, would a economic impact in the United States cause other countries, especially those that are not aligned with it, to catch up and have an exact same impact? No, of course not. And that's why it's called a ripple effect. Because if you drop a stone into water, the ripples get smaller as they go out from the epicenter. And that where that stone hits, you may get a foot rise in wave, but then the very next wave might be an inch, and the one after that 3/4 of an inch, and the one after that 1/2 an inch. Will Nicaragua, as an example, receive a ripple from the United States? That is possible. Will that ripple be a big one or a little one? Most likely a very little one. Could be a big one. But is there any reasonable chance that that ripple will be anything like what happens in the United States? No, not a chance in the world. There's also the possibility, and the very real possibility, probably not the most likely possibility, but a very real one, is that countries that are quite disconnected from the American sphere, Nicaragua being a great example, Peru being a good example, Chile could be an example, where they are much more tied to very distant markets, such as Asia or Europe, may actually buck the ripple and play the global market, where what we generally see is when one place collapses, other places benefit. And there is an absolute possibility, not super likely, but definitely within the realm of possibility, is that markets like Nicaragua will benefit from the collapse of the American economy, or the upheaval of the American economy, or the uncertainty of the American economy. It is true that worldwide economic uncertainty generally lowers everyone. It is a general global suffering. But the places that are causing it get hurt far worse than the places that are not. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it did not cause its ancillary states to collapse. It did cause poverty and disruption in its ancillary states. But getting out from the collapse of Rome would have benefited you. Being in the capital when everything went haywire was the worst possible place to be. The farther you were from it, the better off you were. And once you got relatively far, like northern Germania, once you got into the Sahara Desert, once you got east to Persia, you pretty much were isolated from the issues. And once you got to places like China, they weren't even aware that they were happening other than some news coming on a courier from months before. Nobody noticed. And so that's what we're going to see today, the same things. Far-flung places are not going to follow the U.S. because of a ripple effect. That's not a reasonable thing. There's no reason to believe something like that. Writer Wildly Undivided says, what evidence do you have to support your idea the movement in the U.S. could possibly happen? Notice he's trying to say possibly happen as if we haven't already been seeing it. So we started seeing this last year, but more from Canadians than from Americans during the mid part of the year. Canada went through quite a bit of upheaval. We really noticed an influx of Canadians. It matched what we saw in the news. And of course, the Canadian news reported that Canadians were fleeing to Nicaragua. This is just one location, but it happens to be where I am. And we noticed a real change on the ground of Canadians coming in. That kind of backed off in the news, and we noticed a back off in the Canadians coming to the country. Not that they went away, not that they went down to normal levels, but they weren't at that peak like was at that time. Now, as we came into January, it was predicted that Americans would be coming into Nicaragua more rapidly. This is always going to happen during a time of upheaval. It's really weird to question this because it would be really strange if anything else happened, given the situation in the U.S. or just the belief situation. So it's a very panic feeling thing. It's kind of like saying, if we put tariffs on stuff, what evidence would there be that the prices would go up? Of course they're going to go up. Everyone knows they're going up. No one actually thinks they're not going to go up. That was the plan, right? Now, whether it's worth it to have them go up, that's the thing that people actually mean to be debating. But whether adding cost is going to raise cost is never been something that anyone actually questioned. Just to be clear, there's people who lied about it, but we all knew they were lying about it. There's no one who didn't know they were lying about it, right? Everyone knew they were lying. It's just a cultural thing not to question it. So we all know that the emigration out of the United States is going to increase during a time of upheaval. That's a granted. It's to try to act like there needs to be additional evidence for this, pretty silly. But there is evidence for this. Living on the ground here, it is super evident that we didn't have the timing right. That's actually one of the more interesting things. We were sure that we were going to see a huge uptick in mid-January. Now, I did talk to people, and one of the reasons that we didn't see an uptick is the people I talked to were trapped. They could not get passports because, as someone else asked, is it really, do you have evidence that people aren't getting passports? Well, yes, we're talking to people who can't get passports. They're reaching out to us. What do we do? We've been trying for 6 months to get passports, and I'm not talking about people who are in some banned list. We know that the U.S. is canceling some passport processes, but those are known, right? So that's not a general thing. But people who are just regular people waiting for passports, we've had a number of people who are all saying the exact same thing. They applied, they waited, the status has been removed, and they're on indefinite wait. Now, some did eventually get passports. Some have been waiting most of a year and have not. So it's a direct thing that we've never saw people talking about this before. The U.S. has always been good with passports, COVID notwithstanding. But now we're actually having problems getting passports. This is important stuff to understand, that this is direct observation of predictable things. So when observation matches really obvious logical responses that everybody is sure is what's going to happen, you've got a pretty good situation, right? This is how science works. Now, is there a possibility that we're just seeing a limited slice and that there's a huge decrease in immigration other places and the predictable stuff just didn't come to fruition? Yeah, it's plausible. It's not that there's absolute proof, but is there evidence? There's so much evidence. Like, come on. And you just talk to Americans. How many Americans are talking about getting out? Half of them? How many are normally talking about getting out? 1 out of 50, 1 out of 100? The world has changed, and it's time to not pretend that it's not. These kinds of questions, it's not really helping, right? Because we all know it's happening. Don't pretend you don't know, right? Like, let's just, if you don't want people to move, say so. Boy, I really wish people would stay. I think we can make this work. I don't know if I would trust that assessment, but if that's your argument, make it, right? Don't go with the, oh, I don't think it's really happening. And in this case, trying to pretend that it's going to happen. So we didn't see it happen in January, but by February, we seriously see it. The number of people moving in is unprecedented. I've never seen people coming into the country like this before. It's so unbelievably palpable when you're outside the U.S. Of course, inside the U.S., you're dealing with still very small immigration numbers. I don't know how many immigrate in a normal year. I didn't look it up. Let's say 0.1%. If that doubles to 0.2%, would an average person really notice? No, they probably wouldn't. Somebody would. They'd say, I had one friend leave before, but this year I had 2 friends leave. That seems like a lot. Sure. But in general, the number leaving the United States is relatively small. But the United States is a huge country. So if a 0.1% immigration moved to a 0.2, that would be seriously felt throughout the region. Every country in the region, every country in the world that has any number of U.S. immigrants would instantly feel that change. So here we feel it because it's incredibly obvious, and it really feels more like a 5 to 10% increase, not a 100%, but a 500% to 1,000% increase. Now, that may not be accurate across the region. We may be the country taking a disproportionate number of people because of the type of upheaval pushes them into Nicaragua as a place to look. Maybe my show is moving the needle. A lot of people have accused me of that. I find that unlikely. But that could be happening. Absolutely. And so we may be seeing a disproportionate portion of that. So to us, it might be 1,000%, but to a Mexico, it might be a 0.5% or a 20% or some small number, right? That's plausible for sure. And that you can't sense it in America, plausible. But when I'm in the United States, the conversations that I had with, normal people a year ago, 2 years ago was, well, I'd love to maybe visit some other country someday. And because obviously these are things that people talk to me about. And the difference from a few people being interested in travel to nearly everyone with deep questions about relocation, it doesn't mean that they're going to pack up and go. But once all the conversations start moving to, what would it take for me to move? How do I do that exactly? What would be the benefits? Or like this person with the retirement, what kind of visas could I get? Could I work? How would I earn money? Those conversations have changed from, would I be able to get a margarita by the pool? That sounds fun. To, could I live there and find a way to actually survive? You know that you have to have those conversations before the relocations really start happening in large numbers. It's noticeable. It really, truly is. Mike asks, you don't think the Trump administration will attempt to destabilize Nicaragua like it did in 2018? Well, that's a really good question. Is that a possibility, right? Trump's administration did do this in 2018. That did cause upheaval, and could it happen again? Sure, that is definitely possible. We have a number of reasons to think that that won't happen. One, there's a lot more controls on that now. People are much more aware that that could happen again. There was a certain amount of feeling that post 1990 that the U.S. had backed off after losing the Iran-Contra war, and that maybe there was a period of internal political upheaval as the country figured out what path they wanted to go down. But that has been decided, and things have been relatively non-interventional for the last several decades. It's easy to get complacent, and that seems to be what happened. The U.S. attempted to intervene, and things went relatively poorly. Could that happen again? Yes. Yes, the U.S. could make that attempt. But I think that on the Nicaraguan side, people are, especially those in authority, but the entire population is far more aware that this potential risk exists and are more on the lookout for it, and there's more controls in place. I really do think things got kind of complacent, thinking that the U.S. was just going to give up on messing with Nicaragua. I think that's just an oversight that was made. So I don't think that's going to be made in the near future. Eventually, in 50 years, it could be made again, and then, yes. Second, when the U.S. did this in 2018, the U.S. was broadly bored. That's not exactly true, but you get the point. The U.S. wasn't overly engaged all around the world with a lot of important things going on. The U.S. is not in a good position to mess with other countries unnecessarily right now. It's doing plenty of messing with countries necessarily right now. Things that the U.S. has to do for the U.S.'s own good. Messing with Nicaragua would just be poking the bear. Not that Nicaragua is the bear, but Nicaragua does represent certain types of risk to the United States, and the best thing for the United States to do at this point is to lay low and not create additional animosity in the region. Given that Trump and his administration and everyone else in the government don't like Nicaragua and could try to do some easy things, yeah, that could happen. And we do see some things that could easily end up happening, right? We mentioned them. They could try some sanctions. They could try some flight problems. There's things that they can do relatively easily and not suddenly create a backlash that they have to deal with. But if they're trying to do a destabilizing move like that, I think that they would be facing a backlash regionally at a time where that's a really dangerous thing for the United States. They're already taking traditional, very strong allies like Honduras and pushing them to the point where Honduras is starting to talk about removing the air base for the United States. And that's something that the U.S. depends very heavily on for maintaining stability in the U.S. sense of stability here in the Central American region. If they were to lose that, anything they want to do here is done at arm's length, and suddenly other players, such as Russia and China, may have a better foothold in the region militarily in the case of an active event than the United States does. Those are not things that the U.S. wants to do, and likely they will be considered before they try poking the bear. So yeah, I think it's a reasonable concern, but you have to think about, one, how likely was it the first time? It did happen, right? So it was somewhat likely, but we don't know that it was like a foreseen event that just had to happen. Two, that it happened again after it failed the first time, it's probably not the thing they're going to try to do right away. Generally, you want to go lick your wounds for a while. And three, even if they tried it, yes, that would be negative, but would it really create a problem? It could, for sure, but is it likely to? The U.S. has a really bad track record of being successful at these things, so it's not super likely that even if they did try it, that it would tip any of the scales as far as this discussion, right? Would you still want to live here? Yes. Would you still want to get out of the U.S.? Absolutely. It would triple, quadruple me down on wanting to get out of the U.S. The last thing I want to do is be on the receiving end of that kind of bad behavior. I want to be with the good people, wherever that is in the world, not with the bad people, defined by people trying to mess with someone else. So, especially in a situation of emigration, that would encourage emigration, I think, even more things the U.S. would not want to be doing under those circumstances. So my personal feeling is that it's a low risk because even in 2018, right, would it have made the decision, oh, I don't want to be here? No. And one of our best friends moved in 2018, having been here during many of the events leading up to things there. And she moved back and she's like, it was a really stressful time, but not so stressful that she didn't move from Canada to Nicaragua during that time and say, well, it's still better than Canada. So that's an important, now everybody has a different take on it, but people were still relocating into the country during that time, and those that were on the ground assessing it, I've never heard of anyone who said that they were glad that they left, who stayed long enough to know what was going on. A lot of people left out of panic and never looked back, and they hypothesized that it was far worse than it was, or hypothesized that it would have been terrible had they stayed. But those who stayed universally are like, we're so glad we stayed. It was such a minor thing. Not to downplay a major event like that, but to the people who stayed, in their personal impact, it was very minor. And so that's likely what we would see in the future if the U.S. tried to intervene again. Yes, probably would remain pretty minor, especially as the U.S. is just way too busy everywhere else. 20003 says, I'm just worried about how to get my money out of the U.S., and this is legitimately potentially quite hard. Depending on what you need to do, everyone has a different strategy. And my first thing is I often say don't try to get your money out of the U.S. This is an additional fear. Right? There's one fear, which is that the U.S. economy will go badly, that the situation will just, for one reason or another, and I don't want to be all, oh no, it's the worst thing in the world, just say it may be a scenario where it doesn't make sense for you to stay behind, economically, financially, culturally, whatever, right? Cost of living is going to be bad. Take your pick. Whatever, the combination of things says, well, maybe it's a good time to take advantage of life in another country. That's all we're saying. In many of those cases, I would say you probably want to retain your money in the United States. The U.S. probably is going to maintain a very good banking infrastructure. It's not a guarantee. Nothing's a guarantee at this point. But the U.S. banking is the backbone of the U.S., and having that collapse would trigger so many problems, both for the U.S. and abroad. We don't really think that's going to happen. In most cases, you don't actually want to pull your money out of the U.S. The degree that we talk about of problems in the U.S. don't suggest that that level of problem will happen. So I would say for 90 to 95 or more percent of potential future scenarios with the U.S., you would want your money to stay in the U.S. For those that remain, if you really believe that the ability to keep money and move money in the U.S. is something that is going to keep you at great risk, you have a few options, but you do have to be careful because the U.S. does not just allow you to move your money in and out. It does for the most part, and as long as you're not talking outrageous amounts of money, you probably can get it out. It's probably not that bad, but there's a few things you want to consider. One, you could move into some type of wealth mobility alternative. Mostly this is going to be cryptocurrencies, maybe a stable coin, maybe something like Moneda that doesn't tend to change a whole lot, right? In theory, you could move your wealth into something like that and try to extract it somewhere else. This can be dangerous because there are fluctuations, and sometimes those units are not designed to move the kind of money you're going to be moving, and there may be overhead to doing so, or delays, or you may move into a market where it's extremely hard to pull it back out again. Most of the people who use that stuff abroad end up moving it in and out of those currencies or those mechanisms via the United States, which takes you back to, if you want to use it, it's back in the US again. Not guaranteed, but it could be. So that's a possibility, but generally not a good one. What most people would do is either establish third national banking, for example, opening a Swiss bank account or an account in the Caymans or in Panama and moving your money there. Now, in some cases, you could move it to a place that is outside U.S. jurisdiction or partially outside U.S. jurisdiction where the U.S. has very little ability to manipulate your funds, or you may move it to some place where they have a reasonably high ability, but it is outside the U.S. It depends on what things you're concerned about, what you're trying to fix, but moving things to a Swiss bank account is a common way to go as far as third nationals. Now, what you could do with a primary national, and what that means is in the country you're living rather than a country that just offers you banking. And England is another one as well that you could move things into England. But of course, Switzerland or Panama or the Caymans generally disconnected from the United States. England is a sovereign country, but its fortunes are decently tied to the United States. So if you were to move money there and there was to be an outright collapse of the United States, there's a real concern that they're going to suck England down with them. Someone mentioned, and we talked about sucking Latin America along with them. That is very unlikely. Sucking England along like them is unlikely, but I would say 100 times more likely than bringing Latin American countries down with them because US and UK are so tightly intertwined in so many ways. But you still have those options. But if you're coming to, we'll just use Nicaragua as the example, but this broadly applies. You have local banking. And if let's just say you have $500,000 in the United States, it is cash, you can wire transfer that money into Nicaragua. So choose your country, right? Come and visit. Don't move your money instantly in most cases. Get to Nicaragua if this is the place you choose. Get to Ecuador. Get to South Africa, wherever you want to be. Decide that it truly is where you want to be. Maybe talk to a lawyer and make sure that you're all hunky-dory with visas. You're definitely going to be able to get residency and stay long-term, whatever mechanism is appropriate for that country. We talk a lot about how there's no universal. So here in Nicaragua, you may not even care if you have residency. You come here, you say, I love it. I'm not a criminal. I have no record that's going to get me in trouble. I'm not going to do any activity that's going to get me into trouble. So I'm super confident that I'm just good here. I'm more resilient here as a tourist than I am most places with residency, which is a real thing. You may come to Nicaragua and say, okay, I just want to have my money parked in Nicaragua. It's not the most flexible country, but it should be safe. And so you go to a BAC, a LaFise, BanPro. Here, you open up an account, talk to them, and say you want to move your wealth store into the bank. And you move your $500,000 here. Or maybe you pick a couple different banks or locations. Maybe you want to do it, $250,000 here and $250,000 in Uruguay, just so you have some geographic protections there. That's fine. But you can just do that with wire transfer in most cases if you're looking at actually moving all of your wealth. Now, of course, if you have wealth in real estate and other things, you're going to have to liquidate that, get it into cash, move it out of the country, and then either keep it as cash. And then, of course, you can reinvest or purchase something in a new country. You could buy CDs in a new country. You could invest in a stock market. Be careful with that. Americans do have sanctions against them as far as what they're allowed to do abroad, but generally you can do it. You could be buying real estate. You could just be putting money into the bank account. That's not generally wise on a big scale, but momentarily for sure. So I don't think it's really that hard. It's much more deciding where you want the money to eventually end up and then actioning it in that way. Certainly in the future, I hope to have some information about how people could potentially do that into investment groups here in Nicaragua that are designed for foreigners to make sure that they're not doing activities that are sanctioned for foreigners and provide a certain degree of wealth store capability for people who want to leverage a kind of broader look at the Nicaraguan market. This is a thing that has come up, and because I come from a financial background, a number of people have talked to me about this, and I do have a number of partners who all work in this space, and I do have direct ties to a lot of banking. So I'm kind of in a unique position to potentially look into using Nicaraguan private equity or something similar to it as a means of providing important wealth stores. So that's something we may talk about in the future. We don't know, but that idea could definitely be a thing. And those types of mechanisms, right, may apply. But you do want to have a certain amount of liquidity because as you move to a new country, one, you always want to have the ability to move to yet another country should you need to. But also you want to have enough flexibility that if you decide, well, you want to move into an investment visa, whether here in Nicaragua or somewhere else, that you have the financial resources to do that, because that could be if you're doing a panic move out of the country and moving a wealth store from the U.S. to a new country, that you may really want to look into something like that. It may make a lot of sense. So just something to keep in mind. That's a really deep question. I can't answer that in a quick video, but detailed questions, that would be a really good one, Moi, for jumping on the live stream on Thursdays and asking live, and then I can be like, hey, so what are you worried about with this, or what are you doing with that? And we can have a back and forth that makes a lot of sense. So consider that. It'd be a great place to have it. But I think you've got pretty clear paths in most cases to get it out of the U.S. It's really not that hard. It's just something you'll have to do. All right, I got a comment here from Lou Garau. He says, we are currently here in Nicaragua in Popoyo. That is a beach. It's at the northern end of the southern beaches in Rivas, just below the reserve. We have this kind of break in the middle of the country from a large wildlife preserve. So the southern beaches are below the preserve. The northern beaches are above it. It's the northernmost of the southern beaches that's of any... There's ones north of it, but they're little. It's the big one up there. Very popular with expats, but not so much that it's an enclave, right? So just it's a good choice down there. He says, we fell in love with the area. We initially came here to research different locations, and this is it for us. A close second is El Tránsito up here in León. El Tránsito is the southernmost of the León beaches. He says, but the massive infrastructure investment in the area is a huge factor for us. What he means is the huge infrastructure investment needed for El Tránsito. It's on a dirt road. It's extremely hard to get to from anywhere, so you are quite isolated. It's a nice beach, has a bit there. I'm surprised by how many people really like it when I go there. It's certainly nice. It's a beach in Nicaragua, but I can think of probably 30 beaches that I would like way more than El Tránsito today. I find it an odd place that people like so much. The one thing that's nice about it is it does have a fair-sized village, and it has what feels like some history, but in general, even on its road, it's the last of like 6 beaches on its road that I would pick. But a lot of people seem to like it, so there's something I'm missing or something they're finding that makes it good. Anyway, he says, a lot of opportunity for those who have a good sense of business, and my gut feeling is this place will explode in value. I think it will, but the time is not a couple years, it's many years. But I think Nicaragua has nowhere to go but up, for one thing, and is on a trajectory to do that. It has a lot of the right infrastructure happening, a lot of the right decisions happening, and it's not doing a top-loaded style economy, right? What we're seeing in Nicaragua right now, and hopefully this remains, is a really strong move to the middle class. The super rich are struggling to move past upper middle class, and the poor are getting sucked into the lower middle class, meaning the middle class is expanding. This is what we saw in the United States in the late 1940s, 1950s, when things were going really well. When the disparity was low, it created education opportunities and work opportunities, and people didn't have to work such long hours and such. It was a really healthy way to go, and that's what makes most places that are really amazing to live happen, because their middle class is really strong and they don't have a lot of poverty. Obviously, poverty is just a negative, and they don't have super ultra rich. Super ultra rich also being a big negative. You're rarely gonna not have anyone who's poor. It'd be really hard not to have anyone who's rich. But the more you can create a middle class, a middle ground where people are able to do things, they're able to go to restaurants, they're able to travel, they're able to take vacations, they're able to do fun things, they're able to play video games, they're able to have big screen TVs, they're able to go out and just party and not worry about living month to month. The bigger that is, the more percentage of your population can live that way, the better all of the culture, all the safety, all the everything generally is. Middle class strength equals good living in most cases. So that's an important thing that we're seeing happen here that other countries are losing. And so that's just a really important factor as to what we're seeing on the ground here. So I would agree with Lou that I think Nicaragua is poised not just as a tourist destination to explode, but poised to explode as an economic powerhouse that it traditionally was, because it's got a dedication to education and to that middle class and to quality of life and taking care of its citizens. And those are the things you need so that people have that comfort and capability to then advance the country in really healthy ways. All right, continuing on a couple days later with more comments. Sammy Joni Mitchell, I believe that is correct. I'm pretty far from the screen. My eyes are getting old. I'm so glad I got out. I'm looking to have to fly into Miami to get to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and it's scaring me to have to set foot back in the States. Let me tell you, with all the airplane crashes going on, I'm recording this extra portion just an hour after the plane flipped over in Toronto. There's been so many plane accidents, so much going on in the U.S. Just passing through has gotten pretty scary. I do need to go back really soon. We're talking about going back in a week or two, just for a few days, if all goes well. And it really is getting worrisome. Even just a quick trip back, just the slightest little flight in, really does start to create some worry. I think those who have been in the U.S., it's a little bit more, frog in the boiling water. You don't really feel it. But when you leave and you get that sense of safety and protection and just comfort, and then when you go back, you're like, there's all this stress of like, wait, I'm going to mention this real quick. Back in 2019, I was here visiting, and I was hanging out at the airport with my best friend Rachel, and we met Dr. Beverly from San Juan del Sur, and she was talking about, it was, I think, the first time she was going back home to Atlanta in something like 8 to 12 years, I can't remember exactly, and it was long enough. She's like, I have not worn pants in all that time, which really shows the difference in culture in San Juan del Sur than in the rest of Nicaragua, because we wear jeans all the time, because it's like if you're going out, if you're doing anything, you really got to wear pants. They don't really let you wear shorts all the time. I can wear shorts almost all the time. I can go weeks without putting on jeans, but you always got to put them on sometimes. But she was going back and she's like, she was not prepared for American life. Like, she was super stressed and like really worried about it. And of course, I'm sure everything was fine, but like that mental place you end up in, like, coming here, people are like, it's the unknown, but going back is like, no, it's the known. And now that I experience what life is like outside, going back can be actually kind of scary. So we feel you. All right, I'm gonna hit this one. This is from Oscar Solis 1. He says the problem is that, and this is a real one, and we actually have another video coming on this, and it might get out before this one, so I'm not sure on the schedule right at the moment. The problem is that places are getting gentrified. For instance, Tamarindo in Costa Rica, called Tamagringo. Lol, all businesses, land, and housing are owned by U.S. expats, which is different than Nicaragua, which is primarily Canadian expats. Now, so prices of everything have skyrocketed like crazy. Prices are like 3 to 4 times compared to another non-gentrified places. A bag of Doritos, $12. Pizza for $50. A piece of land, 700 square feet for $300K. A Jeep Wrangler, 2014 for $60,000. It's nuts. Nosara is even worse. There are Airbnbs for $5,000 a week. Yeah, so obviously Costa Rica we use all the time as the example of a place that has run amok and like things are falling apart and life is very difficult because it's gotten so expensive. And a lot of these places, and it's funny because the places that they mentioned that are so expensive are also the places that everyone up here wants to avoid, not just because of the cost. They don't want to go there, like they're unpleasant. They're specifically the parts of Costa Rica that are far less interesting to those of us that are up here. Much less authentic, right? Who wants to go be in an enclave? Now, of course, now he's saying gentrified. I don't think that's accurate, right? What's actually happening is Tamarindo is an enclave. And of course, enclaves are kind of their own economies. What equipment you can get there, what internet you can get there. Often they're now Tamarindo's not quite a formal enclave with walls, but it is an enclave. And so you're paying for enclave living, and that's just how it is. But of course, if you live in Tamarindo, you can just send a driver out of Tamarindo to go pick up all those things and drive back. So if you want to do grocery shopping, you don't have to pay $12 for a bag of Doritos. And in reality, if you're getting any amount of stuff, you can buy it in Nicaragua and drive back. It's not that far. It'll be a long drive. But you could do it. If it was really an economic thing, you could get that stuff from Nicaragua. Yes, there are these isolated places. However, that stuff will happen and will always happen. And Costa Rica is the example throughout the region for these kinds of things. And even in Costa Rica, it's very isolated. We all know the places because they're famous. But it's kind of like saying things are expensive in Disney World. Well, Disney World is not expensive because of immigration in the United States or because of expats or because of anything like that, but it is because of tourism. So it doesn't matter how many expats, and it's not an enclave, right? Disney World remains purely tourist and mostly American tourists, not foreign tourists. There's plenty of foreign tourists. Of course, it's one of the hottest places to go in the world, but it is primarily local, meaning American tourists who go there, and because you want to be close and convenient, you spend way more money on hotels than you normally would. You spend way more money on a bag of chips than you normally would, and so forth. And that's just the nature of a hot tourist destination anywhere in the world. Same thing could be Barcelona, Santorini, you name it, a small place that doesn't have a large population living there. People don't live in Tamarindo broadly, right? Those who are expats who are living in a tourist destination, just like you can now live, I say now as if it hasn't been for 30 plus years, live in Disney World. And if you want to do that, it's super expensive. Right? Why? Because it's effectively an enclave. It's not a racial or cultural enclave. It's just an enclave of people who really like Disney. But they've basically made it a world apart inside Disney World's confines. And so you pay an unbelievable premium for that. But the people who just passionate about that, they are like, yeah, that's fine. I'll pay that anytime because I can't get this experience anywhere else. Same thing with Tamarindo. If you want to be in an enclave like that, then that is your option and you'll pay an arm and a leg to have it. That's natural. I think looking at that as a problem with expats is dangerous because, and we have a full video that goes into just this. But you're looking at extremely isolated places. You can go around San Jose and find loads of places that are minimally impacted by all of the expats. You can go to all kinds of coastal areas in Costa Rica that are minimally impacted by expats. I think Costa Rica, of all places, has pretty much a uniform amount of impact. Like there is noticeable impact throughout the country, but people argue with me that you can really get away. You can get into parts of the country, get away from expats, live in areas where there's still no other expats around and have a very authentic experience where prices remain essentially unimpacted. Of course, there's no way to know exactly what an unimpacted price would be because it is what it is, right? You don't have two universes to go test in. You don't have a control group, but you can pretty much tell that prices have not shifted in a way that would only happen from expats. Much like here in Nicaragua, we do have isolated areas. If you go to San Juan del Sur, the prices get higher, but it's not really an enclave, and it is not oversaturated with expats. It's simply a hot destination, which then attracts expats because it is a hot destination with some unique stuff to offer, and it's kind of isolated, so it doesn't have the evening effect, the leveling effect, of a big city nearby. So even though like Las Bonitas and Ponaloya here, not to the degree of San Juan del Sur by any degree, but have a lot of expats and a lot of tourism, would they get more expensive? Yeah, if you actually want to eat a meal sitting on the sand, they're going to cost more than if you're doing so in downtown Leon, but only by a tiny bit. And mostly it's because food has to drive out a little ways. There's a little bit more effort, and they have a prime spot, so you have to pay for your spot on the beach. Not a big deal. If you're going out to eat in downtown Leon, you're going to be within 10% probably of those prices. It's really not that big of a price premium, but mostly it's because people who are at the beach, if it gets too expensive, they'll just drive back to Leon. If you're in San Juan del Sur, you can't. Not reasonably, you can't get to Rivas for dinner. I mean, you could, but boy, would that be annoying, right? So people pay a premium to sit on the beach and not have to go anywhere. It's natural, right? And even if there were no expats whatsoever, San Juan del Sur would have a price premium. It would be much smaller than it is, but it would still be there. And so I think there's a danger in looking at these places and jumping to expats are creating this huge problem. Is Tamarindo a big problem for Costa Rica? No. Just like Disney World is not a big problem for the United States. I think if you ask most people in the United States, is the fact that Disney World is expensive and attracts a lot of people problematic to you as an American? People would be like, what are you talking about? Of course not. I may not want to go there myself, but it doesn't create problems for me, right? And if you do want to go there, then you're happy to pay the price normally, right? Same thing with Tamarindo. Is Tamarindo creating problems across Costa Rica? No. Is it expensive? Yes, but the people who want to live there don't have a problem with that under normal circumstances. Sure, some of us would love to have a cheap house in Tamarindo if it really didn't cost anything more. Okay, sure, but that's just pie in the sky and silly. We understand that you're going to have to pay more for a place that's highly desired. It's not really gentrification because there wasn't something to gentrify. It is a new creation as an enclave. We're going to dig into quite a bit of that on the upcoming video, but I did want to mention this here that it's important to understand that it's different animals, right? And also, when we're talking about Costa Rica, we can cherry pick and say Costa Rica has Tamarindo, right? We're cherry picking Tamarindo and cherry picking Costa Rica to come up with the country, with the city. It's most extreme. But if you try to recreate that in Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, you go on and on and on, you're not going to find another country that is similar to that. You may be able to point to Belize, but that's a country only the size of the city that I'm in here, which is not even the biggest city in Nicaragua. So yeah, if you get a really, really tiny place, it's easy to have one extra expat show up and cause a big problem. So we're going to dig into that, but I really don't think that that is the kind of worry that people need to have. It's good that we care about these things and don't want bad things to happen to countries and we want to be aware of it. Absolutely. But should we be avoiding it or see it even as a negative that there's a immigration coming from the United States to countries all over the world? No. If there's isolated spots that get way too many, that would be bad. But even in places like Costa Rica, I think they look at Tamarindo as a positive. It's a way to generate revenue in a spot that's very isolated and doesn't impact the rest of the country. So Costa Rica isn't gentrifying, just this isolated little spot. And where does that extra money go? Mostly into Costa Rica. That's a pretty big positive for all the ticas. So they probably, even if they are quite aware of it and have some decision-making power around it, are pretty happy with it. All right, last one I believe that we have, and we're going to get this posted because we are getting pretty long. Sandrine B8370 says, wish I could go now, but we have to wait until we can sell our house and hubby has surgery coming up and convalescence. Not before November for us. Might be too late. We do have valid passports for 8 years and have dual citizenship with France. That gives them a lot of flexibility. Lots of Americans are looking at Spain or Mexico, Panama though, much more than Nicaragua, still from what I've seen in the expat pages. Oh, still, from what she's seen in the expat pages. I hope we can still get something to buy at a reasonable price next year. So this is, again, right, she's echoing kind of a similar fear. That's why I wanted to read them in this order that Oscar mentioned. And this is something that people have been saying for decades in Nicaragua. Well, I got to get down there. I'm in a hurry. I really hope the prices don't go up. And us here in Nicaragua are like, what are you talking about? They're like, if we had 10 times 10 times the number of expats coming in from the United States that we do right now, it probably wouldn't move the needle on prices. Like, people do not understand how far we are from those problems. Now, in Costa Rica, if you had 10 times the total expats going into Costa Rica that you do currently, one, the U.S. would just be depopulated. It would take everybody, right? Not really, but it would be a lot of people because they have so many already. Places like Tamarindo are used as an example of, oh, we looked at this, now it's expensive. Okay, but there's a lot of coast in Costa Rica, and yeah, it's all coast, so it costs a little bit more than, a farm in the middle of nowhere. But there's plenty of affordable in Costa Rica. Still less and less, but it is the example of the most extreme kind of place that it is in Belize than anywhere. And we've done a lot of videos on this, that Costa Rica it's kind of like if Ireland has a potato famine, you don't go, well, I'm flying to Southeast Asia, I sure hope they haven't run out of potatoes. Right? Why would a potato famine in Ireland make you think that there's a potato famine somewhere else, right? They're disconnected. If you don't normally worry about potatoes, don't worry about potatoes there. Just because Costa Rica is in a really unique situation where they have a really minor, and this is important, really minor set of problems that we perceive as foreigners not getting the best price that we want existing in their isolated circumstance should not lead us to have a concern. It should never cross our minds that's going to be happening somewhere else. If there was just Central America and Panama, and we ignore Belize because they're tiny and everything affects them too much, we said, okay, so here's all the reasonably sized Central American and Panama countries. And Costa Rica took on so many expats that it's now overflowing. And now it's going to stop just affecting Costa Rica. It's going to affect other countries in the region. What would happen? Well, the obvious thing is it would overflow to Panama, which already has the next tier of people and attracts people often in the same way that Costa Rica does on a much smaller scale. Okay, over time, Panama would need to absorb those people. And in 10 to 20 years, Panama would also saturate if we had a full overflow coming from Costa Rica. And this is an extreme circumstance that we're talking about. And remember, as overflow happens, as huge numbers come from the U.S. Or from anywhere, the number of people, the amount of pressure to push people out diminishes, right? If you have 350 million people in the U.S. and 3.5 million, 1%, leave, that is noticeable inside the United States. There's more housing available. Cost of living goes down. All kinds of things change. The reasons that you'd want to leave become less major. Right? As another 1% leaves, another 3.5 million leaves, suddenly you have even less need to leave. There's empty houses. It's easy to afford things. Big changes start happening. Mobility of the workforce increases. People start tuning things to make it more attractive to stay because so many people are leaving. As long as there aren't very many people leaving, they're just going to keep ratcheting up the promotions to get you out because they want more people to leave currently. It just makes sense, right? So whatever causes Costa Rica to become oversaturated would be less. Whatever pressure that was that made that happen would be less by the time Panama is saturated. It would be less by the time the next place is saturated. Okay, so this is increasingly unlikely. So if Panama oversaturated, then our next most likely is El Salvador. El Salvador is bigger than either of those countries. And if it took, and it has no momentum in this, a tiny bit, but extremely little, nothing compared to those two countries. So El Salvador, in theory, could take as many expats as Costa Rica has today, and maybe more, and absorb them into their society before it got to the same level of problems as Costa Rica. So we're looking at another 30 to 50 years of mass migration before it got through El Salvador. And this is assuming that Costa Rica and Panama don't empty out at some point. If it then happened to if it then happened to El Salvador, then we would expect it to happen to Guatemala, which Guatemala is many times the size, well, several times the size of an El Salvador. And so Guatemala could absorb an insane number of additional people, so much more than Costa Rica and Panama and Salvador combined that it could absorb in before it started causing real problems. If it filled up, then the Hondurases, then the Nicaraguas would start to see the overflow from there, assuming it didn't go to Mexico or somewhere else. And that's assuming just all this concentrated in Central America. This requires a lot of assumptions that Tamarindo is an example of what's happening to Costa Rica, that it's going to happen to Costa Rica, that it's going to overflow from Costa Rica into Panama, that it's going to overflow from country to country. It would require the entirety of the zone to absorb insane percentages of the U.S. population into their regions before it started really moving the needle in Nicaragua. This is so implausible. And then, right, so the worry is, in a year that this increase is going to move the needle in Nicaragua and it's going to get more expensive. We've been hearing that fear for more than half a decade, and it's not moved at all. But every couple months, someone hypothesizes that there's about to be a change that's going to make it happen in the next few months. This has become old hat. This is like hearing about the Nicaragua Canal. Like, obviously, no Nicaragua Canal is happening in the next 50 years. Obviously, the prices of things here are not moving largely for the next 50 years, right? These are not things that happen overnight. We do not become a new Costa Rica overnight. We are not in line to be the next Costa Rica. If there is a queue of countries that want to take on the type of problems we're hypothesizing about Costa Rica, we're not even in the line yet. We're still in the waiting room to get access to the line. We don't even have a number or anything. We're not being called, right? So this is so unreasonable to actually worry about this kind of stuff. You do not have to worry about this. That's very important. And these kinds of things are what make people make bad buying decisions, right? They get convinced that there's going to be this price increase, right? And right now, the U.S. prices are coming down. They're pulling houses off the market because there's a housing crash going on. That's going to impact Costa Rica to some degree, right? So we may see other countries, we won't see this in Nicaragua, we may see other countries having a decrease in their property values because property values in the U.S. are coming down, and people tend to spend wildly abroad when the U.S. gets too expensive and then pull back when it gets cheap. So we really need to have some rationality about this because it protects you, right? One, your rush to get here is completely about the U.S., right? If the situation in the U.S. is one that you perceive as a negative, it's impacting you, it's a negative for you, get out as soon as you can, right? If you need to sell your house, then get out and sell your house and get out. But let's ask, why do you need to sell your house? Is there a reason why you can't get out before that? Maybe you can sell your house from abroad. Do you really need to be there to sell your house? Is that aiding you? Now, right now, selling your house, super hard, we're hearing, because of they're pulling houses off the market because there's just no buyers. Right, the economy's hitting hard, so it's a buyer's market. So a lot of people don't want to sell now. So that's a real problem. But ask yourself, is it beneficial to wait in the United States while you're selling the house? Maybe sell it from abroad. I'm not saying it's the right thing for you, but it's a right thing to consider. Make sure you mull it over. Second thing, waiting for hubby to get a surgery and then convalesce. Same thing. Is there a reason to do either the surgery or the convalescence in the United States? Absolutely could be a reason. Could be a great reason. Might be they already paid for it. Might be that it's through the VA. Might be that there's special treatment that they can only get there. But also worth throwing around the idea, what if you tried to do it in some other country? Maybe Nicaragua, maybe Colombia, maybe Mexico. Lots of places. At least consider it, and then look at doing a lower cost, more appropriate convalescence here, where for many Americans, even those using the VA, will often find that they get cheaper treatment, believe it or not. And I know the VA is supposed to be free, but there's ancillary cost. And often people find that it is cheaper to pay for surgery here than to get it free in the United States. And if you're doing convalescence, then that much more. Now, there's a lot of factors in your life that we don't know about, right? So we don't want to tell you what's the right thing to do. But these are things you might want to consider, that many people find that they get really worried about moving, and they perceive a couple things. Reasons to stay behind. There's always a difficulty getting yourself out the door, getting on the plane and getting to your new country. But there's often then this urgency that's fake to buy something, that you perceive that there's going to be this increase in prices that you see other places. It's not going to happen here. It's not happening anywhere in Central America, really, right? El Salvador has really obvious reasons why it's happening. Costa Rica, it's been happening for most of a century. None of that is a surprise, right? Those are things that had so much warning, so much foresight. You don't have to worry about getting caught off guard. And I was here in 2019. Everybody was talking about how the prices were just going up. They didn't. They went down. I was here in 2021. Everybody was talking about how the prices had gone up. They didn't. They went down. I was here in 2022, and they kept saying everyone's coming back. The prices are going up. Nope. They stayed steady. 2023, same thing. They stayed steady. 2024. Some more people have given up because they've seen so little movement on the prices that they're starting to accept low offers that they were holding out for higher ones before. So if anything, we're seeing not lower prices, but more movement of lower prices. And now it's 2025. Do we see something that's causing the prices to go up? Not at all. Prices are still staying low, and movement is happening. We're seeing more people in 2025 than 2024 already reaching out and saying, okay, we held off. We were convinced that the prices were going to go up. They didn't. Now it's time to liquidate. We've lost our liquidity, so we're willing to accept the lower prices. The market has remained low for 6, 7, 8 years, right? So that it's remained low, and there's zero, absolutely zero trigger. There is zero indicators that there's going to be an increase in market value in the foreseeable future. Someday, for sure. But nothing is in the cards. Nothing is in the pipeline. And this fear that there's going to be all these Americans coming in, no. You have to remember that we lost a huge number of expats coming in over the last several years, over the last decade, really. And so we're not coming from a position of we have a lot and now we're going to have too many. We're coming from a position of we don't have anywhere near what we used to, and never did we have as many as we should have had. And so we're just fighting really hard to get up to where we were so we can start making advances on where we used to be. That's it. So that gives you a very different perspective. We are not in a position where you should ever be worried about getting in before the prices go up. Not a concern, not at all. All right, guys, that's enough of the feedback on this particular video. I know we're over an hour. Thank you so much for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ScottAllenMiller. You can join our community with the join button. You can send in video questions. You can write in the comments down below. Check out all the information in the show notes. We don't sell anything, so everything in there, like groups to join and other channels to watch and all that kind of stuff, all free other than donating to the channel, of course. And, of course, we have a GoFundMe to help out Marcela, who has stage 4 cancer, and we've been trying to raise funds for her. She needs a total of $5,000 to help her out over the next 2 years to get her through all the things that she has. A lot of things. She needs new clothes. She's losing up to 4 pounds a day currently. She has to go through chemo, has to do a lot of travel for stuff. All of her medical stuff is free, but there's so many ancillary costs, and she's a single mother taking care of kids, so any help that she can get means a lot. We're almost exactly halfway to the goal after just a couple weeks. We do have a while to raise the money, so we're actually making good progress. Really, really appreciate everyone is helping to sponsor her and keep her healthy. So thank you very much, and I will see all of you tomorrow.